Before we begin, I just want to say that this video discusses a real and serious case involving violence and loss of life. My intention is never to cause harm or distress, but to share these stories with care, respect, and awareness. Some details may be limited out of consideration for those involved, and I encourage you to watch with that in mind. And if this case feels like it may be too much for you, please feel free to click away and take care of yourself first. For those of you still here, thank you for being here, and with that said, let's begin. He was charming, intelligent, and someone people trusted. The kind of person you wouldn't think twice about, but behind that image was something far darker. Because for years he was hiding a secret that would shock the world. This is the story of Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy, real name Theodore Robert Cowell, was born on the 24th of November, 1946, making him a Sagittarius to Eleanor Louise Cowell at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. Ted had three younger half-siblings, a brother, and two sisters. His biological father's identity has never been confirmed. His original birth certificate apparently assigns paternity to a salesman and United States Air Force veteran named Lloyd Marshall, though a copy of it listed his father as unknown. Eleanor claimed she met a war veteran named Jack Worthington, who abandoned her soon after she became pregnant. Eleanor's younger sister, Audrey, described him as a nice, reputable person who nevertheless refused to pay child support. Some family members expressed suspicions that Ted was sired by Eleanor's own father, Samuel Cowell. In 1950, Ted's mother changed her surname from Cowell to Nelson and, at the urging of multiple family members, left Philadelphia with her son to live with cousins Alan and Jane Scott in Tacoma, Washington. The following year, she met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook, at an adult singles night at Tacoma's First Methodist Church. They married later that year, and Johnny formally adopted Ted. Johnny tried to include Ted in camping trips and other family activities, but Ted remained distant from him. Ted would later complain to a girlfriend that Johnny was not his real father, wasn't very bright, and didn't make much money. For the first 3 years of his life, Ted lived in the Roxborough neighborhood of Philadelphia with his maternal grandparents, Samuel Necht Cowell and Eleanor Miriam Longstreet. The couple raised him as their son to avoid the social stigma that accompanied childbirth outside of wedlock at that time. Yet Ted got told that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his sister. Ted eventually discovered the truth, although his recollections of the circumstances varied. He told a girlfriend that a cousin showed him a copy of his birth certificate after calling him a bastard, but he told biographers Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth that he had found the certificate himself. Ted did not find out his true parentage until 1969. Ted expressed a lifelong resentment toward his mother for never telling him about his real father, and for leaving him to discover the truth about his paternity for himself. In 1987, however, he and other family members told attorneys that Ted's grandfather was a tyrannical bully who beat his wife and dog, swung neighborhood cats by their tails, and expressed racist and xenophobic attitudes. In one instance, Ted's grandfather reportedly threw his daughter down a flight of stairs for oversleeping. He would sometimes speak aloud to unseen presences, and at least once flew into a violent rage when the question of Ted Bundy's paternity was raised. Ted Bundy described his grandmother as a timid and obedient woman who periodically underwent electroconvulsive therapy for depression and was afraid to leave their house toward the end of her life. As Ted Bundy grew older, there were subtle signs that something beneath the surface wasn't quite right. On the outside, he continued to present himself as intelligent, polite, and well put together. He was able to blend in easily, often coming across as someone people trusted. But privately, things were different. From a young age, he was known to be secretive, keeping parts of his thoughts and behavior hidden from those around him. There was a sense of emotional distance, as if he was observing rather than truly connecting with others. As he moved into his teenage years, this became more noticeable. While he maintained a normal appearance socially, there were underlying behaviors that suggested a growing disconnect. Nothing at the time clearly pointed to what was to come, but looking back, those early signs were there, hidden beneath the surface. As Ted Bundy moved into adulthood, the hidden side of his life began to surface. At first, it wasn't immediately obvious. He continued to present himself as normal, studying, working, and building relationships. To those around him, he still seemed like someone you could trust, but beneath that, something was changing. In the early 1970s, reports began to emerge of young women going missing in the areas where he was living. At the time, there was no clear connection, just isolated cases that didn't yet form a pattern. What made it even more unsettling was the way he operated. He was able to approach people without raising suspicion, often appearing calm and convincing. For a while, no one realized what was really happening, but as the number of incidents grew, it became clear that this wasn't random. There was a pattern forming, and that pattern would soon lead investigators much closer to the truth. Based on what we know, these are the victims that have been linked to Ted Bundy. On January 4th, 1974, an 18-year-old student named Karen Sparks was attacked while asleep in her home in Seattle. She survives. However, the attack left her with permanent brain damage. On 1st February 1974, Linda Ann Healy disappeared from her home in Seattle after being taken during the night. Her disappearance marks one of the first major cases that would later be linked. On 12th March 1974, a 19-year-old Donna Gail Manson vanished while on her way to a concert at Evergreen State College. She was never found. On April 17th, 1974, 18-year-old Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared after attending a college meeting at Central Washington State College. Skull and mandible were recovered at Taylor Mountain site in 1975. Both had been severely fractured. Her case adds to the growing concern across the area. On 6th May 1974, 22-year-old Roberta Kathleen vanished from Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon. Skull and mandible recovered at Taylor Mountain site in 1975. She had been bludgeoned to death. On 1st June 1974, a 22-year-old named Brenda Carol Ball disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien and was last seen in the parking lot talking to a man with his arm in a sling. Skull and mandible recovered at Taylor Mountain site in 1975. Her skull had been fractured. On 11th June 1974, 18-year-old Jorgen Hawkins was abducted from an alley behind her sorority house. Skeletal remains identified by Ted as those of Jorgen recovered at Issaquah site. Jorgen remains listed as a missing person. On July 14th, 1974, 23-year-old Janice Ann Ott was abducted from Lake Sammamish State Park in broad daylight and was last seen leaving the park with Ted Bundy, who had asked for her assistance with putting his sailboat on his car. Skeletal remains recovered at Issaquah site in 1974. On 14th July 1974, 19-year-old Denise Marie Naslin was abducted 4 hours after Janice Ann Ott from Lake Sammamish State Park and was last seen walking towards the restrooms. Skeletal remains recovered at Issaquah site in 1974. On October 1st, 1974, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox was last seen leaving her home at 9 p.m. in Holiday, Utah, after getting into an argument with her father. Ted Bundy claimed that her body was buried near Capitol Reef National Park, 200 miles south of Salt Lake City, but never found. On the 18th of October 1974, 17-year-old Melissa Ann Smith vanished from Midvale, Utah, after leaving a pizza parlor to walk back to her home. Body was found 9 days later on a hillside in Summit Park, Utah. Her head had been severely beaten with a crowbar, and her body had been beaten before death. On October 31st, 1974, 17-year-old Laura Ann Amy disappeared from Lehi, Utah, on her way home from a Halloween party. Her body was discovered by hikers in American Fork Canyon. Her face was beaten beyond recognition, and she had been strangled and sexually assaulted. On November 8th, 1974, 18-year-old Carol DeRanche picked up from the Fashion Place shopping mall in Murray, Utah, lured by Ted Guise of claiming to be a police officer, investigating vehicle break-ins in the parking lot. She escaped by jumping out of Ted Bundy's vehicle after he inadvertently fastened a pair of handcuffs on the same wrist. The very same day, 17-year-old Deborah Jean Kent vanished after leaving a school play in Bountiful, Utah. According to Ted Bundy, her body was left near Fairview, 100 miles south of Bountiful. One patella was subsequently found at this location in 1989. In 2015, it was positively identified by DNA as Deborah's on 12th of January 1975. 23-year-old Corinne Eileen Campbell disappeared from a hotel hallway in Snowmass Village, Colorado. A month later, on the 17th of February, her body was discovered on a dirt road near the hotel with skull fractures and knife wounds. On the 15th of March, 1975, 26-year-old Julie Lyle Cunningham disappeared from Vail, Colorado after she left her apartment in the Apollo Park neighborhood to visit a local tavern. Her body was never found. On 6th April 1975, 24-year-old Denise Lynn Oliverson was abducted while cycling to her parents' house in Grand Junction, Colorado. Her body was never found. On 6th May 1975, 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver was abducted from Pocatello, Idaho, after she left Alameda Junior High School for her lunch break. Her body was never found. On June 28, 1975, 15-year-old Susan Curtis disappeared during a youth conference at Brigham Young University when she left her friends to walk back to her dormitory and brush her teeth. Her body was never found. On January 15, 1978, 4 young women were attacked in their sleep at Chi Omega sorority at Florida State University. 21-year-old Margaret Elizabeth Bowman was bludgeoned and strangled. 20-year-old Lisa Janet Levy was bludgeoned, strangled, bitten, and sexually assaulted. 21-year-old Karen Chandler was bludgeoned. She did survive, although her skull was fractured, and her jaw, right arm, and fingers were crushed. 21-year-old Kathy Kleiner was bludgeoned, resulting in her jaw being shattered and her right cheek being ripped open. She survived. 21-year-old Cheryl Thomas, bludgeoned as she slept 8 blocks from Chi Omega, survived after having a fractured jaw and skull, which left her with permanent deafness in her left ear and equilibrium damage. On 9th February 1978, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was abducted from Lake City Junior High School in Lake City, Florida, and was last seen being led to a white van by a man who was later identified as Ted Bundy. Her body was found 43 miles west of Lake City, and as the list continued to grow, it became impossible to ignore. This wasn't random. There was a pattern. As the pattern became impossible to ignore, investigators began working to connect the cases. Witnesses started to come forward, describing a man who appeared calm, approachable, and completely unthreatening. It was this image that allowed him to get close without raising suspicion. From these accounts, a name began to surface: Ted. And soon after, a full name: Ted Bundy. On 16th August 1975, Ted Bundy was arrested by Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward in Granger, another Salt Lake City suburb. Bob observed Ted cruising a residential area in his Volkswagen Beetle during the pre-dawn hours and fleeing at high speed after seeing the patrol car. Bob also noticed that the Volkswagen's front passenger seat had been removed and placed on the rear seats. Searching the car, Bob found a ski mask, a second mask fashioned from pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, a coil of rope, an ice pick, and other items initially assumed to be burglary tools. Ted Bundy explained that the ski mask was for skiing. He had found the handcuffs in a dumpster, and the rest were common household items. However, Detective Jerry Thompson remembered a similar suspect and car description from the Day Ranch kidnapping in November 1974, and Ted Bundy's name from Elizabeth Clofer's phone call a month later. The police searched Ted Bundy's apartment. The only evidence they did find was a guide to Colorado ski resorts with a checkmark by the Wilderwood Inn, and a brochure that advertised the Viewmont High School play in Bountiful, where Deborah Jean Kent had disappeared. Police did not have sufficient evidence to detain Ted, so he was released on his own recognizance. When Ted was released, he went straight to his apartment and noticed that police missed a hidden collection of Polaroid photographs of his victims, which he destroyed. Salt Lake City police placed Bundy on 24-hour surveillance, and Thompson flew to Seattle with 2 other detectives to interview Elizabeth Klopfer. She told them that in the year prior to Ted's move to Utah, she had discovered objects that she couldn't understand in her house and in Bundy's apartment. These items included crutches, a bag of plaster of Paris that he admitted stealing from a medical supply house, and a meat cleaver that was never used for cooking. Additional objects included surgical gloves, an oriental knife in a wooden case that he kept in his glove compartment, and a sack full of women's clothing. Ted Bundy was perpetually in debt, and Elizabeth suspected that he had stolen almost everything of significant value that he possessed. When she confronted him over a new TV and stereo, he warned her, "If you tell anyone, I'll break your fucking neck." She said Ted Bundy became very upset whenever she considered cutting her hair, which was long and parted in the middle. She would sometimes awaken in the middle of the night to find him under the bed covers with a flashlight examining her body. He kept a lug wrench taped halfway up the handle in the trunk of her car, another Volkswagen Beetle which he often borrowed, for protection. The detectives confirmed that Ted had not been with Elizabeth on any of the nights during which the Pacific Northwest victims had vanished, nor on the day Ott and Naslund was abducted from Lake Sammamish State Park. Shortly thereafter, Elizabeth was interviewed by Seattle homicide detective Kathy McChesney and learned of the existence of Edwards and her brief engagement to Bundy around Christmas 1973. In September, Ted Bundy sold his Volkswagen Beetle to a Midvale teenager. Utah police immediately impounded the vehicle, and FBI technicians dismantled and searched it. Hairs were discovered matching samples obtained from Campbell's body. Later, they also identified hair strands microscopically indistinguishable from those of Smith and DeRanche. FBI lab specialist Robert Neal concluded that the presence of hair strands in one car matching 3 different victims who had never met one another would be a coincidence of mind-boggling rarity. On October 2nd, detectives put Ted Bundy into a lineup. DeRanche immediately identified him as Officer Roseland, and witnesses from Bountiful recognized him as the stranger at the Viewmont High School auditorium. There was insufficient evidence to link him to Kent, whose body had not yet been found, but more than enough evidence to charge him with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault in the DeRanche case. Ted Bundy denied knowing DeRanche but had no alibi, and was freed on $15,000 bail, paid by his parents, and spent most of the time between indictment and trial in Seattle, living in Elizabeth Kloepfer's house. Seattle police had insufficient evidence to charge him in the Pacific Northwest murders, but kept him under close surveillance. When Ted and I stepped out on the porch to go somewhere, Kloepfer wrote, so many unmarked police cars started up that it sounded like the beginning of the Indy 500. In November, the 3 principal Ted Bundy investigators, Jerry Thompson from Utah, Robert Keppel from Washington, and Michael Fisher from Colorado, met in Aspen, Colorado, and exchanged information with 30 detectives and prosecutors from 5 states. While officials left the meeting, later referred to as the Aspen Summit, convinced that Ted Bundy was the murderer they sought, they agreed that more hard evidence would be needed before he could be charged with any of the killings. In February 1976, Ted Bundy stood trial for the DeRanche kidnapping. On the advice of his attorney, John O'Connell, he waived his right to a jury due to the negative publicity surrounding the case. After a 4-day bench trial and a weekend of deliberation, Judge Stuart Hanson Jr. found Bundy guilty of kidnapping and assault. In June, he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. In October, Ted Bundy was found hiding in bushes in the prison yard carrying an escape kit, road maps, airline schedules, and a social security card, and spent several weeks in solitary confinement. 201. Later that month, Colorado authorities charged him with Campbell's murder. After a period of resistance, he waived extradition proceedings and was transferred to Aspen in January 1977. On June 7, 1977, Ted Bundy was transported 40 miles from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs to Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a preliminary hearing. He had elected to serve as his own attorney, and as such was excused by the judge from wearing handcuffs or leg shackles. During a recess, Ted Bundy asked to visit the courthouse's law library to research his case. While shielded from his guard's view behind a bookcase, he opened a window and jumped to the ground from the 2nd story, injuring his right ankle as he landed. After shedding an outer layer of clothing, Ted Bundy limped through Aspen as roadblocks were being set up on its outskirts, then hiked south onto Aspen Mountain. Near its summit, he broke into a hunting cabin and stole food, clothing, and a rifle. The following day, Ted Bundy left the cabin and continued south toward the town of Crested Butte, but became lost in the forest. For 2 days, he wandered aimlessly on the mountain, missing 2 trails that led downward to his intended destination. On June 10th, Ted Bundy broke into a camping trailer on Maroon Lake, 10 miles south of Aspen, taking food in a ski parka. However, instead of continuing southward, he walked back north toward Aspen, eluding roadblocks and search parties along the way. 3 days later, he stole a car at the edge of an Aspen golf course. Cold, sleep-deprived, and in constant pain from his sprained ankle, Ted Bundy drove back into Aspen, where 2 police officers noticed his car weaving in and out of its lane and pulled him over. He had been a fugitive for 6 days. In the car were maps of the mountain area around Aspen that prosecutors were using to demonstrate the location of Campbell's body, as his own attorney, Ted Bundy, had rights of discovery, indicating that his escape had been planned. Back in jail in Glenwood Springs, Ted Bundy ignored the advice of friends and legal advisors to stay put. The case against him, already weak at best, was deteriorating steadily as pre-trial motions consistently resolved in Ted Bundy's favor, and significant pieces of evidence were ruled inadmissible. A more rational defendant might have realized that he stood a good chance of acquittal, and that beating the murder charge in Colorado would probably have dissuaded other prosecutors. With as little as a year and a half to serve on the DeRanche conviction, had Ted persevered, he could have been a free man. Instead, Ted Bundy assembled a new escape plan. He acquired a detailed floor plan of the Garfield County Jail and a hacksaw blade from other inmates. He accumulated $500 in cash, smuggled in over a 6-month period by visitors, Boone in particular. During the evenings, while other prisoners were showering, Ted Bundy sawed a hole about 1 square foot between the steel reinforcing bars in his cell's ceiling. Having lost 35 pounds, he was able to wriggle through and explore the crawl space above in the weeks that followed. Multiple reports from an informant of movement within the ceiling during the night were not investigated. By late 1977, Ted Bundy's impending trial had become a cause célèbre in the small town of Aspen, and Ted Bundy filed a motion for a change of venue to Denver. On December 23rd, the Aspen trial judge granted the request, but to Colorado Springs, where juries had historically been hostile to murder suspects. On the night of December 30th, with most of the jail staff on Christmas break and nonviolent prisoners on furlough with their families, Ted Bundy piled books and files in his bed, covered them with a blanket to simulate his sleeping body, and climbed into the crawl space. He broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening with his wife, changed into street clothes from the jailer's closet, and walked out the front door to freedom. After stealing a car, Ted Bundy drove eastward out of Glenwood Springs, but the car soon broke down in the mountains on Interstate 70. A passing motorist gave him a ride into Vail, 60 miles to the east. From there, he caught a bus to Denver, where he boarded a morning flight to Chicago. Back in Glenwood Springs, the jail's skeleton crew did not discover the escape until noon on December 31st, more than 17 hours later. By then, Ted Bundy was already in Chicago. After his capture, Ted Bundy was brought to trial, where the evidence against him continued to grow. He was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to death. From that point on, he was held on death row in Florida, where he remained for years as appeals and legal proceedings continued. During this time, he gave interviews, often speaking about his past, but many questioned how much of what he said was the truth. As the years passed, the case remained one that people couldn't look away from, until finally in 1989 his sentence was carried out. This case is one that continues to shock even decades later. It raises difficult questions about how someone could appear so normal while hiding something so dark, because to those around him he was charming, intelligent, and trusted. But behind that image was something far more dangerous. And perhaps that's what makes this case so unsettling. The idea that sometimes evil doesn't always look the way we expect. Thank you for watching Into the Night Stories. And as always, stay safe out there.